Yeah, so tonight we're carrying on the End Time series, and tonight I really want to focus on the significance of Jerusalem. And I want to be sort of looking at that over a few different periods, I suppose. I want to look at it in the past, looking at the Old Testament in particular, and why was it that Jerusalem itself was important to the ancient Israelites, and then looking outside the Bible, looking at the sort of at the history and the events that have happened since then. What's the sort of current state, and how did we get there? And then sort of looping back around to the Bible and prophecy in particular, how is it that Jerusalem relates to the end times as well, and what do we sort of think for the future? And as a bit of a aside, I suppose, throughout the whole talk, I'm going to be sort of touching upon the idea of whether or not God is still working for the salvation of the Jews. I'm not going to touch too much on current events. Obviously, there's conflict going on in the Middle East, and I'm not going to focus too much on that, and rather on what the Bible has to say about these things. But I think hopefully we might be able to paint something of a picture of hope anyway. That through all these events, that God remains sovereign and has a plan for Jerusalem, and yeah, we'll be exploring more about that as we go through the talk tonight. Um, so kicking off, looking at the past and asking ourselves, why is it that Jerusalem matters to the Jews and to the ancient Israelite nation in particular? Really, it goes all the way back to the promise that was made to Abraham. So in Genesis 17, we read this. So Abraham fell face down, and God said to him, "As for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be Abraham, for I have made you a father of many nations. I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you, for the generations to come, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you." And so the ancient Israelites really saw Abraham as the father of their nation, right? And there is a question to be asked about this promise of him being the father of many nations. Is that the different Israelite tribes? Is that now the Gentile nations who have come to faith through this promise? And so there's a question to be asked as to whether God is still, this promise still applies to the Jews, or whether the sort of Christian church have inherited it. But regardless, why is it that Jerusalem itself is significant? Well, it's when Abraham was about to sacrifice Isaac. And so we read in Genesis 22 that then God said, "Take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain that I will show you." And it's really this Mount Moriah, which is then later becomes the site of the temple. And so we read in 1 Chronicles that Solomon, he began to build the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem on Mount Moriah, where the Lord had appeared to his father David. It was on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite, the place provided by David. And so, there's a little bit more context. We can look further back in Chronicles. So David was sort of the first person that went and conquered the Jerusalem for the Israelite nation. So we read in 1 Chronicles 11 that David and all the Israelites marched to Jerusalem, that is Jebus. The Jebusites who lived there said to David, "You will not get here." Nevertheless, David captured the fortress of Zion, which is the city of David. And so it's this site which then becomes the sort of historic capital of the Israelite nation. And so this is after Moses has received the law. The Israelites have been walking around in the wilderness and have now sort of got into the promised land. And so God's presence had been in the tabernacle, right, this mobile tent. But there was a desire that there was going to be this temple that was built for God to dwell in instead. And in 1 Chronicles 17 we read that "Go and tell my servant David that this is what the Lord says. You are not the one to build me a house to dwell in. I will raise up your offspring to succeed you, one of your own sons, and I will establish his kingdom. He is the one who will build a house for me, and I will establish his throne forever." And so yeah, it's David's son Solomon who then goes on to build this temple, and it's on Mount Moriah where Abraham was going to sacrifice Isaac, and so that's really why that site itself is significant to the Jews. And I think it's interesting to explore this picture as well, that it's going to be this picture of God's throne forever, right? Like that was the promise that was made. And so after Solomon has built the temple, they're bringing the Ark of the Covenant into its resting place in the Holy of Holies in the temple, and we read that Solomon said, "The Lord had said that he would dwell in a dark cloud. I have indeed built a magnificent temple for you, a place for you to dwell forever." There's similar imagery in Psalms 132. The Lord swore an oath to David, a sure oath that he will not revoke. One of your own descendants I will place on your throne. If your sons keep my covenant and their statutes I teach them, then their sons will sit on your throne for ever and ever. For the Lord has chosen Zion, he has desired for it to be his dwelling, saying, This is my resting place for ever and ever. Here I will sit enthroned, for I have desired it. So it is this picture, right, of it's this everlasting place where God's presence is going to remain. Now, interestingly, in the Psalm, it's conditional. This promise, right? It's if the sons keep the covenant, and obviously we know that the Israelite nation didn't manage to keep the law, right? That's the whole point of the gospel, is that we need salvation from Jesus, because as humans we can't keep the law, and yet, right, that there was this promise that this is going to be the place where God's presence will rest. And even focusing just on the Old Testament, so the part of the Bible that the Jews would still believe today, in Isaiah we see end time prophecy referring to the fact that the temple is still going to be in Jerusalem, right? So in Isaiah 2 we read, In the last days the mountains of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. Many people will come and say, Let us go up to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, so that we may walk in his paths. The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. So again, it's this picture that God's presence is in Jerusalem, dwelling, in a temple, and that law and this place of spiritual significance, right? And it's coming out from Jerusalem to the other nations. Um, so okay, I've painted something of a picture of historically why was Jerusalem important to the Jews, but fast forwarding to today, we've seen many events in that region since the Bible, and so we might ask what's the sort of current arrangement, and why is it that the currently Jews and Muslims both claim significance over Jerusalem, and why are they living in such close proximity there? So I want to sort of briefly outline, the city of Jerusalem as it is today. So this is the Google Maps of a large portion of the city. The old city is this region in the middle where many of the sites that we read about in the Bible are located. And so if we zoom in on this bit, you can see that around the edge there's these gates which still stand. These would have been the old historic gates through the city wall into this fortified city, as it would have been in biblical times, and we still see evidence of that today. And then there are many sites around which we read about in the Bible. The Temple Mount is probably the most significant. This is where the Mount Moriah, which was this high place which the temple was built upon. There's Gethsemane, which is obviously where Jesus went and prayed in the Garden of Gethsemane before he was arrested and then crucified. The Mount of Olives is nearby, the location where Jesus ascended to heaven after he was resurrected. So we sort of see all these significant sites, but today, so there's a sort of a divide in some sense. So the Western Wall is perhaps the oldest sort of surviving part of the old temple complex, and this is a really significant spot for Jews who live there today, because of its relation to the old temple, and so many people would go and visit it, would pray there. People often write prayers and put them in the in cracks on paper in the wall, and so this is a very significant location for the Jews. But then on the mountain itself, so you can just see in the picture of the Western Wall at the top of the hill is this golden dome, and this structure is the Dome of the Rock, which is a building that was built by Muslims over the rock where they thought that Abraham was going to be sacrificing Isaac, and so it's on the location of the old the ancient temple that we read about in the biblical times. And so I guess there's a brief sort of history as to how all this came to be. So in the Old Testament, we read about Solomon building the very first temple. The Jews are then exiled from Jerusalem by the Babylonians. The Babylonians destroy the temple, and then later, when the Jews come back to Jerusalem, a second temple is rebuilt. And it's this second temple that we read about when Jesus is visiting Jerusalem. He warns that the temple is going to be destroyed, and then Jesus is trialed in Jerusalem and crucified nearby there on the mount, nearby there, and then but then later, after Jesus's life, the Romans then take over. The Roman Empire is taking over the region. They destroy the temple. Jews are all thrown out from Jerusalem, and then 300 years after Jesus, Christianity is finally legalized in the Roman Empire, and so there's Christian churches popping up in Jerusalem, but still the Jews are not allowed there. Right, there is no temple. And so we see that it's quite a long period where the Jews are not in Jerusalem. In about 600 AD, the Muslims then conquer that region. So the Ottoman Empire, which was taking over many of the countries that we see in the region today. So they conquer it. They build this dome of the rock, and that was sort of linking back to the Abrahamic heritage, because they see Abraham as a prophet in their religion as well, and they also think that this is the site where their prophet Muhammad ascended to heaven. So there's this significance, for both Jews, for Christians, and for Muslims as well. Fast forwarding to World War One, so this is where the Ottoman Empire collapsed, right? So they sort of sided with the losing side in the World War, and the British ended up controlling Jerusalem. And part of that was strategic because it's nearby the land bridge, from Europe into Africa, and so from there they could protect the Suez Canal, which was a very important trading link between England and India, which was one of the British colonies at the time. So yeah, part of it was strategic, and part of it obviously was because of the religious significance as well, right? Britain being a Christian country at the time, and the fact that all these events of the Bible had happened there. And then shortly after World War II, there was this push for Israel to once again become a nation. And really, this was in response to the Holocaust, right? So throughout this whole period, there'd been a huge amount of persecution against against Jews, and this desire for them to have some place to call home, because they'd been scattered across the whole world, living in many different countries. And then more recently than that, in 1960s, there was a Six-Day War where Israel then took control of the Temple Mount once again, but they left the sort of administrative control to the Muslims. So although technically Israel has control over the land, the Muslims are still able to go and pray in the Dome of the Rock, and Jews are banned from going and praying on the old Temple Mount. So I think, I've sort of painted a picture of where we're currently at, and so I guess it's now worth looking forward and asking ourselves, why is it that Jerusalem is still important, and what significance does it have for end time prophecy? And I guess the sort of fundamental answer to that question is that it's the sort of most commonly held view amongst Bible scholars for the location where Jesus is going to return in his second coming. And there's lots of passages that we could look at here, but Zechariah 14 is a good one that then sort of ties in nicely with a lot of the prophecy in Revelation as well. So let's read Zechariah 14 together. So, a day of the Lord is coming, Jerusalem, when your possessions will be plundered and divided up within your very walls. I will gather all the nations to Jerusalem to fight against it. Then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations, as he fights on a day of battle. On that day his feet will stand on the Mount of Olives, east of Jerusalem, and the Mount of Olives will be split in two from east to west, forming a great valley, with half of the mountain moving north and half moving south. On that day there will be neither sunlight nor cold, frosty darkness. It will be a unique day, a day known only to the Lord, with no distinction between day and night. When evening comes, there will be light. On that day, living water will flow out from Jerusalem, half of it to the east to the Dead Sea, and half of it west to the Mediterranean Sea, in summer and in winter. The Lord will be the king over the whole earth, and on that day there will be one Lord, and his name the only name. So the first thing to point out is this sort of prophetic image that on this day of the Lord, that Jesus' feet are going to once again stand on the Mount of Olives east of Jerusalem, and that's significant because it's where Jesus ascended to heaven from. So we read about the ascension in Acts 1. So the disciples are asking, Lord Jesus, are you at this time going to restore the kingdom to Israel? And Jesus replies, it's not for you to know the times or the dates that the Father has set by his own authority. And Jesus goes on to talk about the end times, and then he ascends to heaven. And where is all this taking place? Well, in verse 12, we read that the apostles then return to Jerusalem from the hill called the Mount of Olives. And so there's this sort of the image that Jesus is taken up from the Mount of Olives, and so in Zechariah and other places we read that that's where he's going to return to at the end times. Um, and then in this prophecy in Zechariah 14, we see lots of other parallels to Revelation. So we know we're sort of talking about the end times here. So this idea that there's going to be many nations coming against Jerusalem, fighting against it. In Revelation 16, the sort of final offensive of Satan, we read that there's going to be this gathering of kings to a place that's in Hebrew called Armageddon, and Armageddon is this location about 50 miles north of Jerusalem, which people think is going to be this sort of staging ground where armies are going to gather to then come and attack Jerusalem. We read about the Mount of Olives being split apart, and then in Revelation, there's so much imagery regarding earthquakes that are associated with the end times. We then also in this Zechariah prophecy read that the Lord will go out and fight against these nations which are attacking Jerusalem, and this again is what we read in Revelation 19 when Jesus returns, right? So in Revelation 19 that we see heaven standing open. There was before me a white horse whose rider is called Faithful and True, and from other parts of that chapter we know that this rider is Jesus, that he's coming back in a robe dipped in blood. His name is the word of God, and coming out of his mouth is a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations, right? So it's this picture that Jesus, as he comes back to defeat the devil, is also defeating these human nations who are waging war against Jerusalem and against the Jewish nation. And then finally, in Revelation 22, this is sort of what happens next after the Lord has gone out to fight against these nations. In Zechariah, we're reading that there's no distinction between day and night, that there's living water flowing out from Jerusalem, and this is echoed in Revelation 22, the picture of the new Jerusalem, the new heaven, the new earth, the sort of final state that we get there. So we read it in the New Jerusalem that there's a river of the water of life flowing from it, and then also this picture that there's no more night, that there's no need for the light of a lamp or the light of the sun, for the Lord God will give them light. So yeah, I think it's sort of clear that even in the Old Testament and in the sort of Jewish prophecy that Jerusalem is important, and then obviously in the sort of the New Testament as well, there's sort of further elaboration of this, and it lines up very well. So it's clear that Jerusalem is this point that will still be significant in the end times. And so I guess it's sort of then worth asking ourselves the question: well, is the modern Israel, is that just a name that's been borrowed from history, or is it a continuation of the Old Testament nation? Right? If we're really asking this question of is God still working for the salvation of the Jews, and are these promises that were made to Abraham, have they been transferred to the Christian church, or are they still applicable to the Jews? Then it's worth sort of asking ourselves this question, right? And I think at the very least, we've got to say that God is still sovereign over the events in Jerusalem, right? Like he's clearly sovereign over all the earth, but particularly the fact that Jerusalem is so tied up with end time prophecy, it's clear that God still has plans for that place, right? And I think particularly though in with recent world events going on in that region, it is also worth pointing out that regardless of the answer to this question, that doesn't make Israel above reproach, right? The ancient Israelite nation, too, they didn't keep God's law, right? They were, as with all humans, they were sinful, and so sort of regardless of whether or not yet they are still part of God's plan and God's chosen nation. We're not expecting to make us think that means that there's no flaw in them, right? But so okay, so let's have a look at what the Bible says about this, right? And does it point forward to there being a modern day Israel? So one example, well, personally, I believe that there is biblical evidence, right? That there was. This is part of God's plan that a modern day Israel would reform as a nation. And a good example of this is in Isaiah 11. So in that day, the root of Jesse will stand as a banner for the peoples. The nations will rally to him, and his resting place will be glorious. In that day, the Lord will reach out a hand a second time to reclaim the surviving remnants of his people from Assyria, from Lower Egypt, from Upper Egypt, from Cush, Elam, Babylonia, from Hamath, and the islands of the Mediterranean. He will raise a banner for the nations and gather the exiles of Israel. He will assemble the scattered people of Judah from the four quarters of the earth. So personally, I think this has to be referring to like a post-Jesus state, right? Because the root of Jesse, we read elsewhere, the root of David. This is describing Jesus, the fact that Jesus is standing as a banner, that nations are rallying to him. Like that has to be after Jesus, right? And so this picture that God is going to reach out a second time to reclaim, the remnants of Israel and bring them back to the promised land. Some people would argue that the first time was when they were called out of Egypt, and the second time was when they were called, back from the Babylonian exile. But if this passage is referring to a time after Jesus, then it seems more likely to me that the first time was after the Babylonian exile, and the second time is after the Roman exile, right? So the Jews were thrown out in around 70 AD, and only really within the last 100 years have come back to that region. And where are they being called from? Well, from around the Middle East. We read all these about all these countries, but then also we read from the four quarters of the earth, right? So the Jews were called back from all other parts of the earth as well, and certainly that's what we saw after World War II, right? That there were Jews, in America and across Europe and elsewhere as well, that then went back to the promised land. Um, and there's other passages as well that refer to this, which we won't go through in detail for brevity. But in Ezekiel, we read that it will gather them from all around and bring them back into their own land. Right, so this picture of like all over the earth that they'll return to this region. Um, but so okay, so why does this matter? And I've sort of alluded to this previously, but really it is going back to this promise that was made to Abraham, right? That he's going to be a father of many nations. And so the question really is, is that fulfilled through the Christian church, through the Gentile nations that came from Abraham, or is God still working, for the salvation of the Jews and for the Israelite nation? Um, well, I think one of the best passages to show that God is still working for their salvation is in Romans, and so let's read this together. Romans 11. I am talking to you Gentiles, insomuch as I am an apostle to the Gentiles. I take pride in my ministry, in the hope that I may somehow arouse my own people to envy and save some of them. For if the rejection brought reconciliation to the world, what will their acceptance be but life from the dead? It is part of the dough offered as first fruits. If part of the dough offered as first fruits is holy, then the whole batch is holy. If the root is holy, so are the branches. If some of the branches have been broken off, and you, though a wild olive shoot, have been grafted in among the others, now share in the sap from the olive root. Do not consider yourselves to be superior to those other branches. If you do, consider this. You do not support the root, but the root supports you. You will say, branches were broken off so that I could be grafted in. Granted, but they were broken off because of unbelief, and you stand by faith. So it's really this picture of grafting, right, in the sort of botanical plant world, and the olive tree is often in the Bible used to represent Israel, and so this is referring to the Gentile nations being grafted in to the Jewish nation, effectively. And I've got a picture on the right here of a plant which is underground growing potatoes and above the ground growing tomatoes, and this is an example of grafting, right? And it's so the tomato plant and potato plant are very similar plants, and so they're sort of compatible to be grafted together in this way. But I think the reason this is quite a good picture is because it's really obvious that there's like two different plants here in some sense, right? You've got like the roots underground, which are genetically a potato, and then you've got the tomato plant on top. Growing tomatoes, and their stems have been like interlinked, right? So that nutrients from underground, from the water, is being brought up through the potato plant's roots and provided to the tomato plant on top. And that's really like the image that we're seeing here in Romans, right? Is this idea that the Gentile nations are these wild olive branches that are grafted in to the existing tree, and that existing tree is the Jewish nation, the Israelite nation, and that they're sharing in the nourishing sap from the olive root. But I think from this, it's clear to say that the Christian church haven't replaced the Jewish nation, right? It's not that there's this new plant; it's that no, they've been joined together. And there's other parts of the Bible that talk about this, but I think if we carry on in Romans 11, we read this passage. I do not want you to be ignorant of this mystery, brothers and sisters, so that you may not be conceited. Israel has experienced a hardening in part until the full number of Gentiles has come in, and in this way all Israel will be saved. So this seems like quite a clear promise to me, right? That God is still working for the salvation of Israel, for the salvation of Jews, right? It's not that this promise is transferred to the Christian church, rather it's that the Christian church is is grafted in, and so has gained access to this promise, and yet God is still working for the Jews and for their salvation as well. And so um, and then as another picture of this, in Revelation, when we read about the New Jerusalem, this final state, it's, I think, made clear that it's for Jews and Gentiles alike, right? So in Revelation 21, we read, "The holy city Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God. It shone with the glory of God, and its brilliance was like that of a very precious jewel, like a jasper, clear as crystal. It had a great high wall with 12 gates, and with 12 angels at the gates. On the gates there were written the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. The wall of the city had 12 foundations, and on them were the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb." So it's this picture, right, that this new city, this new Jerusalem, there's 12 gates, and on them are the 12 names of Israel, right? So clearly Israel is represented in this city. But then also the foundations are the 12 apostles, right? And these are the apostles which went on to form the church. And so clearly this city is for both, Jew and for Gentile. Um, then last week as well, when we talked about the Revelation judgments, we talked about this idea that Jew and Gentile would be protected and sealed in some way from these judgments. And as a reminder of that, we get a similar picture, right, where 144,000 from all the tribes of Israel, and talking about the tribe from the tribe of Judah, from each tribe, 12,000 people were sealed. So clearly, again, like there's protection for the Jews, but then also there's this description of the great multitude that no one could count from every nation, tribe, people, and language, right? So talking about the Gentiles. So yeah, it seems clear to me that in the new heaven and the new earth is going to be both Gentile and Jew alike. And so as a final closing thought, what am I saying here? Well, we know through the Bible that there is no way to salvation except through Jesus, right? I mean, there's so many passages that talk about that in the Bible. But as one example, Acts 4, Jesus is the stone that you builders rejected, which has become the cornerstone. Salvation is found in no one else, for there is no other name under heavens given to mankind by which we must be saved. So, am I implying that there's, some second secret plan by which the Jews are going to be saved? Well, no, I don't. I don't think that's the case, right? Like God doesn't lie. The Bible is infallible, and so clearly the only way for the Jewish nation, for the Israelite nation, to be saved is to come to see Christ as the Messiah, right? Like they were waiting for a Messiah. They didn't accept Jesus as the Messiah, and so how is this going to come about? Well, obviously we don't know the future in its fully. Um, but I think we referred to this in a previous talk when we talked about the timeline of the end, and it seems to me that if you take the view that there is this physical millennial reign where Jesus returns to Earth and is ruling on Earth, that during that period, that's going to be the period where the Jewish nation and where Israel come to see Jesus as the Messiah. They accept him as Messiah, and so as we read in Romans that affected their hearts have been hardened, so that the Gentiles might be saved. Then at some point in the future, this promise which God has made in the Old Testament is still going to be brought to fruition. Right? God is still working to save the Jews, to save the Israelites, and for them to come to accept Christ as the promised Messiah. So yeah, in my mind, this paints a real picture of hope, right? That although we see so much turmoil and strife in the region, certainly at the moment, but throughout the last 2,000 years as well. Despite all that, God is still sovereign over these events, is still working to bring salvation to all people. So we're going to move into a time of discussion now. There's many things that we could talk about. Perhaps one is this idea of like the Abrahamic promise. Do you think that was fully fulfilled with the church, or do you sort of agree with this view that God is still working to redeem the Jews as well? And then perhaps it's also worth thinking that how can we reconcile all this human-caused destruction and strife in Jerusalem with God still being sovereign over these things? Is that an encouragement to us when we see difficulty in our lives that God is still sovereign through this? And then finally, if there's time at the end, perhaps it would be good as well to have a time of prayer for God to be working, especially at the moment in the Middle East, that He would bring, peace, and that He would bring His salvation to all people.